The Harrington mansion stood on top of a hill in Connecticut, like a castle from another time. It had 47 rooms, gardens that stretched for acres, and more wealth inside its walls than most people could ever dream of. But for 19-year-old Elena Reyes, this place was not a fairy tale. It was simply where her mother worked. Rosa Reyes had been a housekeeper for the Harrington family for 15 years. She cleaned their floors, washed their dishes, ironed their clothes, and smiled politely even when they never bothered to learn her name. To the Harringtons, she was just the help, a ghost who kept things tidy and disappeared when guests arrived. Elena had grown up watching her mother come home exhausted every single night. Rosa's hands were rough and cracked from years of scrubbing. Her back ached from bending over toilets and bathtubs that cost more than their entire apartment. But she never complained. Not once. Because everything she did was for her daughter. Education. Rosa would always say, "That is your way out, Mia. Study hard. Make something of yourself. Do not end up like me." But school had never been easy for Elena. They moved around a lot when she was younger, chasing whatever work Rosa could find. Elena changed schools 5 times before she turned 12. She never had time to make real friends or catch up with lessons she had missed. Teachers looked at her and saw just another poor kid who would probably drop out. What nobody knew was that Elena had a gift. A gift she discovered completely by accident. It happened when she was 8 years old. Rosa had brought her to the mansion during summer break because she could not afford a babysitter. While her mother cleaned upstairs, Elena wandered through the endless hallways, careful not to touch anything. She knew the rules. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Do not cause trouble. But then she found the ballroom. It was the biggest room she had ever seen. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds, like a church. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, catching the sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows across the marble floor. And in the center of it all, raised on a small platform like a king on a throne, was the most beautiful thing Elena had ever laid eyes on. A grand piano. It was enormous and black and shiny, like something from a movie. Elena did not know anything about pianos back then. She did not know that this particular instrument was an 1885 Steinway, one of the rarest in the world, worth over $2 million. She did not know that it had once belonged to a European prince, or that collectors had offered fortunes to buy it. All she knew was that she had never wanted to touch something so badly in her entire life. She looked around. The house was silent. Her mother was 3 floors up, busy with laundry. Just one touch, Elena told herself. Just one. She climbed onto the leather bench and pressed a single, white key. The sound that came out made her whole body shiver. It was the purest, most beautiful note she had ever heard. It filled the entire room and seemed to hang in the air like magic. She pressed another key. Then another. Before she knew it, both hands were on the keyboard, picking out a simple melody she had heard somewhere before. It was clumsy and awkward, but it felt right. It felt like coming home. From that day on, Elena was obsessed that she could not afford lessons. She could not afford a piano. But she had something else. She had determination that burned like fire inside her chest. Every day after school, Elena would walk to the public library and use the old computers to watch piano tutorials on YouTube. She studied videos of famous pianists, watching their fingers move across the keys, memorizing every detail. She borrowed books about music theory and taught herself to read sheet music. At night, she practiced on a paper keyboard she had drawn herself, pressing imaginary keys on her blanket until her mother told her to go to sleep. And whenever Rosa brought her to the mansion, whenever the Harringtons were away on vacation or business trips, Elena would sneak into that ballroom. She knew it was risky. She knew that if anyone caught her, her mother would lose everything. But she could not stay away. That piano called to her like a voice in her dreams. At first, she could barely play simple songs. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star took her 3 weeks to figure out. But Elena did not give up. She practiced for hours, teaching herself piece by piece, note by note. Months turned into years. Her fingers grew stronger. Her ear grew sharper. The paper keyboard was eventually replaced by a cheap electronic one she bought at a thrift store for $20. But it was nothing compared to the real thing. The Steinway became her secret teacher, her best friend, her escape from a world that constantly reminded her she was not good enough. By the time Elena turned 19, she could play pieces that most professional pianists have struggled with: Beethoven, Mozart, Liszt. But her favorite was Chopin. There was something about his music that spoke to her soul. It was sad and beautiful at the same time, full of longing and hope. When she played Chopin, she forgot about the cramped apartment, the unpaid bills, the pitying looks from classmates who had new clothes and fancy phones. She forgot about everything except the music. One Thursday evening in October, Elena found herself alone in the mansion once again. The Harringtons had flown to Paris for a charity event. They would not be back until Monday. Rosa was in the kitchen, finishing up for the night. Elena slipped into the ballroom and sat at the piano. The autumn sun was setting outside the tall windows, painting the room in shades of gold and orange. It was her favorite time to play. The light made everything feel magical, like she had stepped into another world. She took a deep breath and began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the hardest pieces ever written for piano. Professional musicians spent years trying to master it. But Elena had been working on it in secret for almost 2 years, practicing the same passages over and over until her fingers ached. Tonight, something was different. Tonight, every note came out perfectly. Her hands flew across the keys like they had a mind of their own. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, filled with passion and pain and triumph. Elena closed her eyes and let herself disappear into the sound. She played for herself, for her mother, for every person who had ever looked at her like she was nothing. She played until tears streamed down her cheeks and her heart felt like it might burst. When the final note faded into silence, Elena sat there trembling. She had never played like that before. It felt like something sacred had just happened. Then she heard it. A slow clap coming from somewhere behind her. Elena's blood turned to ice. She spun around on the bench, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. A man stood in the doorway of the ballroom. He was tall and gray-haired, dressed in an expensive suit, with cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. It was Richard Harrington III, the billionaire owner of the mansion, the man who paid her mother's salary, the man who was supposed to be in Paris. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "What do we have here?" "The maid's daughter playing my piano." Elena could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. In that moment, she was certain her life was about to fall apart. Elena sat frozen on the piano bench, her fingers still hovering over the keys. Every muscle in her body had turned to stone. She wanted to run, to disappear, to somehow turn back time and undo the last hour of her life. But it was too late. Richard Harrington had seen everything. The billionaire walked slowly into the ballroom, his leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with each step. He moved like a man who owned the world, because in many ways, he did. His real estate empire stretched across 3 continents. His face appeared on magazine covers. Presidents asked for his advice. And right now, all of his attention was fixed on the terrified girl sitting at his $2 million piano. "Do you have any idea," he said, stopping a few feet away from her, "what you are sitting on?" Elena's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. That piano, Richard continued, belonged to a prince. It survived 2 world wars. Collectors have offered me $5 million for it, and I turned them down. He tilted his head, stunning her like she was some kind of strange insect. And here you are, the housekeeper's daughter, playing it like it belongs to you. I'm sorry. Elena finally managed to whisper. I'm so sorry. Please don't fire my mother. She doesn't know. She has no idea I come in here. Please, this is all my fault, not hers. Richard raised an eyebrow. Fire your mother? Is that what you think I'm going to do? Elena nodded, tears starting to blur her vision. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He just stood there, looking at her with those cold blue eyes that gave nothing away. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was not the kind of laugh that made you feel safe. It was sharp and mocking, like the sound a cat makes before it catches a mouse. You know, he said, walking in a slow circle around the piano, I came home early because the Paris event was a disaster. Boring speeches. Terrible food. I was in a foul mood. But now? He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Now I think my evening just got a lot more interesting. Elena did not understand. She had expected shouting. She had expected threats. She had not expected this strange, amused curiosity. How long have you been doing this? Richard asked. Sneaking in here. Playing my piano. Elena swallowed hard. There was no point in lying now. Since I was 8 years old. 11 years. Richard let out a low whistle. And your mother never knew? No, sir. She would have stopped me. She follows the rules. She always follows the rules. Unlike her daughter, apparently. Elena hung her head in shame. She had been so careful. So quiet. And now one mistake had ruined everything. Richard walked to the tall windows and looked out at the darkening sky. That piece you were playing. Chopin's Ballade in G minor. Do you know how difficult that is? Yes, sir. Professional pianists train for years to play it properly. Some never manage. He turned back to face her. Where did you study? Which conservatory? Which teacher? I didn't, Elena said quietly. I taught myself. Richard's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. Taught yourself, he repeated. You expect me to believe that? It's the truth. I watched videos online. I borrowed books from the library. I practiced on a paper keyboard. I drew myself because we couldn't afford a real one. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I practiced every single day for 11 years. This piano was the only real one I ever got to touch. The room fell silent. Richard stared at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Then something shifted behind his eyes. A new kind of interest. A new kind of amusement. The kind that made Elena's stomach twist with fear. I'm hosting a charity gala this Saturday, he said suddenly. 300 guests. The most powerful people in the country will be there. Politicians, CEOs, movie stars. And I had arranged for a world-famous pianist to perform during dinner. He paused. Unfortunately, he canceled yesterday. Some kind of family emergency. Very inconvenient. Elena had no idea where this was going, but she knew it could not be good. Richard turned to face her fully, a strange smile playing on his lips. So here's what I'm thinking. You believe you're some kind of musical genius, yes? A diamond in the rough? A secret prodigy that the world has overlooked? I never said that, Elena whispered. But you believe it. I can see it in your eyes. Richard took a step closer. So let's put it to the test. Let's see if you're really as talented as you think you are. Or if you're just a foolish girl who got lucky with one pretty song. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Play at my gala, Richard said. In front of 300 guests. In front of critics and musicians and everyone who matters in this country. His smile widened. Play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. The entire third movement. Without mistakes. Without embarrassment. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that piece. Every pianist knew that piece. It was called the hardest piano concerto ever written. Professional musicians spent years preparing for it. Some called it impossible. Some had their careers destroyed by attempting it. If you can do that, Richard continued, his voice soft and dangerous, if you can perform that piece without humiliating yourself and me in front of my guests, I will give you $100 million. Elena was sure she had heard wrong. What? $100 million? Enough to buy your mother a mansion of her own. Enough to go to any music school in the world. Enough to never worry about money again for the rest of your life. The number was so enormous that Elena could not even process it. $100 million. It was more money than she could imagine. More money than everyone she knew would ever earn combined. But Richard was not finished. However, he said, and the word hung in the air like a blade, if you fail, if you stumble, if you miss notes, if you embarrass me in front of my guests, your mother is fired. Immediately. No severance. No reference. You will both be out of this house by sunrise, and I will make sure that no family in this state ever hires her again. Elena felt like she had been punched in the stomach. You can't do that. I can do whatever I want, Richard said simply. I own this house. I own your mother's job. And right now, I own your future. He leaned in close, so close that Elena could smell his expensive cologne. So, what do you say? Do we have a deal? Before Elena could answer, the ballroom doors flew open. Rosa Reyes stood in the doorway, her face pale with terror. She had heard everything. Please, Rosa begged, rushing toward them. Please, Mr. Harrington, she's just a child. She didn't mean any harm. Punish me if you want, but please leave my daughter out of this. Richard looked at Rosa with the same expression a person might give to a fly buzzing near their food. This doesn't concern you. She is my daughter. Everything about her concerns me. Rosa grabbed Elena's hand and tried to pull her toward the door. Come, Mia. We're leaving. We'll find other work. We don't need this. But Elena did not move. She looked at her mother's hands. Those rough, cracked hands that had scrubbed floors and washed dishes for 15 years. She looked at the lines on her mother's face, the gray in her hair, the exhaustion that never seemed to leave her eyes. Rosa had sacrificed everything for her. Everything. And what did she have to show for it? A tiny apartment. An old car that barely ran. A life of serving people who did not even know her name. This was a chance to change all of that. A terrifying, impossible, insane chance. But a chance nonetheless. I'll do it, Elena said quietly. Rosa gasped. Elena, no. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Mama. Elena squeezed her mother's hand and looked her in the eyes. I've been preparing for this my whole life. I just didn't know it until now. Richard clapped his hands together, delighted. Wonderful. Then it's settled. Saturday night. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. He started walking toward the door, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. Oh, and one more thing. You might want to practice. You have exactly 5 days. He disappeared into the hallway, his laughter echoing behind him. Rosa collapsed into a chair, her whole body shaking. What have you done, Mia? What have you done? Elena stood at the piano, her hands trembling. 5 days. She had 5 days to learn the most difficult piece of music ever written. 5 days to prepare for a performance that could change her life forever. or destroy it completely. She sat down on the bench, placed her fingers on the keys, and took a deep breath. There was no time for fear now. There was only time for music. That first night, Elena did not sleep at all. She sat at the piano in the ballroom until her eyes burned and her fingers screamed for rest. The sheet music for Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 was spread out in front of her, page after page of notes so dense they looked like a foreign language. She had heard this piece many times before. She had watched videos of famous pianists performing it. She knew it was considered the Mount Everest of piano music. What she did not fully understand until that moment was just how impossible it truly was. The third movement alone had passages that required her hands to stretch wider than seemed humanly possible. There were sections where both hands had to play completely different rhythms at the same time. There were runs of notes so fast that her fingers tripped over each other again and again. By 3 in the morning, Elena had made it through only the first 2 pages. Her back ached from hunching over the keyboard. Her wrists throbbed with pain, and a small voice in the back of her mind kept whispering the same terrible thought. You cannot do this. You are going to fail. You are going to destroy everything. She pushed the voice away and kept playing. Rosa found her daughter still at the piano when the sun came up. Elena's eyes were red and swollen. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, but she refused to stop. You need to eat, Rosa said, setting down a plate of eggs and toast. You need the rest. I can't, Mama. I don't have time. Elena. Rosa knelt beside the piano bench and took her daughter's hands in her own. Listen to me. If you destroy your body, you won't be able to play at all. You have to take care of yourself. Elena wanted to argue, but she knew her mother was right. She forced herself to eat a few bites and drink some water. Then she went right back to practicing. The hours blurred together. Day became night, became day again. Elena barely noticed. The only thing that existed was the music, the keys, and the relentless ticking of the clock, counting down to Saturday. On the second day, something unexpected happened. Elena was struggling with a particularly brutal passage in the middle of the movement. No matter how many times she tried, her left hand could not keep up with the speed. She slammed her fists on the keys in frustration, the ugly sound echoing through the empty ballroom. That's not how you do it. Elena spun around. An old man stood in the doorway, dressed in the plain black uniform of the mansion staff. She recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Chun, the butler who had worked for the Harringtons even longer than her mother. He was quiet and polite, the kind of person who seemed to fade into the background. Elena had never really spoken to him before. Excuse me? She said. Mr. Chun walked slowly toward the piano. He must have been at least 70 years old, with thin white hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes. But there was something sharp in his gaze, something Elena had never noticed before. That passage, he said, pointing to the sheet music. You're tensing your wrist. That's why you can't hit the speed. You need to relax. Let gravity do the work. Elena stared at him. How do you know that? For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then he sat down on the bench beside her, placed his wrinkled hands on the keys, and began to play. Elena's jaw dropped. Mr. Chun played the exact passage she had been struggling with, and he played it perfectly. His fingers moved like water over the keys, smooth and effortless. The notes poured out like they were the easiest thing in the world. When he finished, he folded his hands in his lap and smiled softly. I was a concert pianist once. In Shanghai. A long time ago. What happened? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Chun's smile faded. Life happened. My family needed money, so we came to America. I had to work. I had to survive. There was no time for music anymore. He looked down at his hands. I haven't touched a piano in over 30 years. Not until just now. Elena felt tears pricking at her eyes. Here was a man who had the same gift she did, the same love for music. And he had been forced to give it all up, just to put food on the table. Will you help me? She asked. Mr. Chun looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. It would be my honor. From that moment on, everything changed. Mr. Chun became Elena's secret teacher. Every night, after the Harringtons went to bed, he would slip into the ballroom and sit beside her at the piano. He showed her techniques she had never learned from YouTube videos. He taught her how to breathe with the music, how to let her emotions flow through her fingers, how to find the soul hidden inside the notes. Technique will get you through the piece, he told her, but soul is what will make people remember you. Play with your heart, and they will feel it. Word of Elena's challenge spread quietly through the mansion staff. The other workers had always liked Rosa, and they admired her daughter's courage. One by one, they began to help in their own small ways. The gardener, a kind man named Vicente, who had immigrated from Mexico 20 years ago, started bringing Elena plates of food so she would not forget to eat. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Park, who rarely spoke but had the warmest eyes, made sure there was always hot tea and honey waiting for Elena to soothe her throat and calm her nerves. Even the young housekeeper who worked alongside Rosa began covering her shift so Rosa could spend more time with her daughter. Nobody told Richard Harrington. Nobody breathed a word to any member of the family. This was their secret, their rebellion. A small army of invisible people, all working together to help one of their own. On the third night, Elena finally made it through the entire third movement without stopping. It was messy. It was imperfect. But she played every single note from beginning to end. When she finished, Mr. Chum placed a hand on her shoulder. "Good," he said simply. "Now do it again. Better." She did. And again. And again. By the fourth day, her fingers were raw and blistered. Rosa wrapped them in bandages and begged her to rest. Elena played through the pain. There was no other choice. On the morning of the fifth day, something shifted. Elena sat at the piano as the early light streamed through the windows, and she played the entire movement from memory. No sheet music. No hesitation. Just her and the keys and the ghost of Rachmaninoff guiding her hands. When the last note faded, she realized she was crying. Not from sadness or fear, but from something she could not name. It felt like standing on top of a mountain after climbing for years. It felt like finally being seen. Mr. Chun stood in the corner of the room, tears streaming down his own weathered face. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They both knew what had just happened. That evening, Rosa came to help Elena get ready. The gala would begin in a few hours. 300 guests were already arriving, their expensive cars lining the long driveway like a parade of wealth. Rosa had borrowed a simple, black dress from one of the other housekeepers. It was not fancy. It was not designer. But when Elena put it on and looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You look beautiful, Mia," Rosa whispered, her voice cracking. Elena turned and hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you, Mama, for everything. For your whole life." Rosa pulled back and held her daughter's face in her hands. "I am already proud of you. No matter what happens tonight. Do you understand? No matter what." Elena nodded, blinking back tears. Somewhere in the mansion, she could hear music playing and glasses clinking and laughter from people who had never known what it meant to struggle. People who had never been invisible. Tonight, she would walk into that room. Tonight, she would sit at that piano in front of everyone who had ever looked through her like she was nothing, and she would show them exactly who she was. Elena took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the ballroom. It was time. The ballroom had been transformed into something out of a dream. Thousands of tiny lights hung from the ceiling like stars. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above tables covered in white silk and gold-rimmed plates. Flowers that cost more than Elena's monthly rent decorated every corner. And everywhere she looked, there were people dripping in diamonds and designer clothes, laughing and drinking champagne like money meant nothing at all. Elena stood just outside the entrance, hidden behind a marble pillar, watching the guests arrive. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. Her palms were slick with sweat. The simple black dress that had looked fine in the mirror suddenly felt shabby and cheap compared to the gowns floating past her. 300 people. That's what Richard had said. 300 of the most powerful, most wealthy, most important people in the country. And she was about to walk in there and play for all of them. What was she thinking? She was nobody. A housekeeper's daughter who had learned piano from YouTube videos and library books. These people had probably been to hundreds of concerts at the finest halls in the world. They had heard the greatest musicians alive. They would see through her in an instant. A gentle hand touched her shoulder. Elena turned to find Mr. Chan standing behind her. He was dressed in his usual butler's uniform, but there was a warmth in his eyes that steadied her racing heart. "I know what you're feeling," he said quietly. "I felt it too, the first time I performed. The fear, the doubt, the voice that tells you that you don't belong." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "That voice is lying," Mr. Chun continued. "You have worked harder than anyone in that room. You have earned your place at that piano. Now go in there and show them what the invisible ones can do." He squeezed her shoulder once, then stepped back into the shadows where he belonged, where they both had always belonged. Until tonight, Elena took a deep breath. Then another. Then she stepped out from behind the pillar and walked into the ballroom. The moment she entered, she felt the stares. Guests turned to look at her, their conversations trailing off into whispers. She heard fragments as she passed. "Who is that? Is she lost? I think she's one of the staff." Elena kept her eyes forward and kept walking. The piano sat on a raised platform at the far end of the room, waiting for her like an old friend. She focused on it, and nothing else. Richard Harrington stood near the front of the room, surrounded by a group of wealthy-looking men in expensive suits. When he saw Elena approaching, a slow smile spread across his face. He raised his champagne glass in a mocking toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "May I have your attention, please?" The room fell silent. All 300 guests turned to look at Richard, then followed his gaze to Elena, who had frozen halfway to the piano. "Tonight, we have a very special performance planned," Richard continued, clearly enjoying himself. "As some of you know, our scheduled pianist had to cancel at the last minute. Very disappointing. But fortunately, a replacement has volunteered." He gestured toward Elena with his glass. "This young lady is the daughter of my housekeeper. She has generously offered to play for us this evening." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elena saw eyebrows raise, saw lips curl into amused smiles, saw people lean toward each other to whisper behind their hands. "She will be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, Richard announced. The third movement. In full, now the murmurs turned to gasps. Elena saw several people shake their heads in disbelief. A woman in a red gown actually laughed out loud. "This should be interesting," someone muttered. Richard's smile widened. He was enjoying every second of this. To him, Elena was nothing but entertainment. A joke he had set up for his wealthy friends. He fully expected her to fail, to crumble, to run from the room in tears, and then he would fire her mother, just like he promised. Elena felt the fear rising in her chest like a wave. For one terrible moment, she thought she might actually turn and run. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred. The whispers of the crowd sounded like a roaring ocean in her ears. Then she thought of her mother, Rosa, who was watching from somewhere in the back of the room, too afraid to stand near the front. Rosa, whose entire life had been spent serving people who never saw her as human. She thought of Mr. Chung, who had given up his dreams so his family could survive, who had poured his heart into teaching her these past 5 days. She thought of every person who had ever looked at her like she was nothing, every teacher who had written her off, every classmate who had mocked her worn-out shoes, every voice that had ever told her she would never amount to anything. Elena lifted her chin and walked the rest of the way to the piano. She sat down on the bench. The leather was cool beneath her. The keys gleamed under the lights, black and white, waiting. The room had gone completely silent. 300 people held their breath. Elena placed her fingers on the keys. She closed her eyes, and she began to play. The first notes came out shaky. Her hands were trembling too much. She heard a few snickers from the audience. Someone coughed. Doubt screamed in her mind. Then she remembered what Mr. Chun had told her. Play with your heart. Let them feel it. Elena stopped trying to be perfect. She stopped worrying about the audience, about Richard, about everything that could go wrong. She let all of it fall away until there was nothing left, but the music. Her fingers found their rhythm. The trembling stopped, and suddenly the music poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. The room changed. Elena couldn't see it with her eyes closed, but she felt it. The energy shifted. The snickers stopped. The whispers died. 300 people who had come expecting a disaster found themselves leaning forward in their seats, caught in something they hadn't expected. The music built and swelled, crashing like thunder, then pulling back to whispers as soft as falling snow. Elena played the longing and the struggle, the hope and the heartbreak. She played her mother's tired hands and Mr. Chun's lost dreams. She played every hour she had spent at that piano, dreaming of a life that seemed impossible. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The music had taken over, and she was just along for the ride. In the back of the room, Rosa had her hands pressed over her mouth, sobbing silently. Mr. Chun stood beside her, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. Near the front, the woman in the red gown who had laughed earlier was now wiping her eyes with a silk handkerchief. The men in expensive suits had forgotten their champagne. Even Richard Harrington sat motionless, his mocking smile long gone, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. The final passage approached. The most difficult part. The part that had broken professional pianists and ended careers. Elena's hands flew across the keys. The notes came faster and faster, building toward the climax. Her heart pounded. Her breath caught. Everything she had worked for came, down to these final seconds. She struck the last chord. The note rang out through the ballroom, pure and perfect, hanging in the air like a prayer. Then silence, complete. Absolute silence. Elena opened her eyes. For a moment, she thought something had gone wrong. No one was moving. No one was making a sound. 300 faces stared at her with expressions she couldn't read. Then a single person stood up. Then another. Then 10 more. Then the entire room was on its feet, and the silence exploded into the loudest applause Elena had ever heard. People were cheering. People were crying. People were shouting, "Brava!" and clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. The sound washed over Elena like a wave, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She looked toward the back of the room and found her mother. Rosa was standing with both hands over her heart, tears streaming down her face, pride shining in her eyes brighter than any diamond in that room. The applause went on and on. 7 minutes. 8. People rushed toward the platform, wanting to shake her hand, wanting to know her name, wanting to know where she had come from. But Elena wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Richard Harrington, who was still sitting in his chair, frozen, staring at her like he was seeing a ghost. For the first time since she had met him, he had nothing to say. The applause seemed to go on forever. 8 minutes passed, then 9, then 10. People rushed toward the platform where Elena sat, their hands reaching out to touch her, to shake her hand, to be near her. Business cards were pressed into her palm. Names and phone numbers were whispered in her ear. Words like extraordinary and genius and once in a lifetime floated around her like confetti. But Elena barely heard any of it. Her eyes were locked on Richard. Harrington, the billionaire, had not moved. From his chair, his champagne glass sat forgotten on the table beside him. His face, which had been so smug and mocking just 30 minutes ago, now looked like it belonged to a man who had seen something he couldn't explain. Slowly, the crowd began to notice. The applause faded. People turned to look at Richard, waiting to see what he would do. After all, everyone in that room had heard about the wager. Richard had made sure of that. He had wanted them all to witness his little joke, to watch the maid's daughter crumble and fail. But she hadn't failed. She had done the impossible. The ballroom fell silent again. 300 pairs of eyes moved back and forth between Elena and Richard, waiting. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Richard Harrington did something that nobody expected. Something that would be talked about in wealthy circles for years to come. He stood up from his chair. He straightened his jacket. And he walked slowly toward the platform where Elena sat. Each footstep echoed in the silent room. Elena watched him approach, her heart pounding. She didn't know what he was going to do. Part of her still expected him to find some way out, some excuse, some trick to avoid honoring his promise. Richard stopped at the edge of the platform. He looked up at Elena, and then, in front of every guest, every camera, every witness in that glittering room, he lowered his head in a bow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard Harrington, one of the richest and most powerful men in the country, was bowing to a housekeeper's daughter. When he raised his head, there was something different in his eyes. The coldness was still there, but it had cracked. Something else was showing through. Something that looked almost like respect. "I underestimated you," he said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the room, everyone heard him clearly. "I underestimated your mother. I underestimated everyone who works in this house." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong." Elena stared at him. In all the scenarios she had imagined, she had never pictured this. She had expected anger. She had expected excuses. She had not expected an apology. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim leather folder. He opened it, revealing a single piece of paper. A check. He held it up so the crowd could see. $100 million, he announced. As promised, the room erupted again. People shouted and cheered and clapped. Cameras flashed from every direction. Elena heard her mother crying somewhere in the back of the room, but she didn't reach for the check. "Not yet." Richard frowned. "Well, take it. You earned it." Elena stood up from the piano bench. Her legs were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'll accept it," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "on one condition." The room went quiet again. Richard raised an eyebrow. "A condition?" "You're in no position to negotiate." "Maybe not," Elena said. "But I'm asking anyway." She looked out at the crowd, at the diamonds and the designer gowns and the faces of people who had never known what it meant to struggle. Then she looked toward the back of the room, where her mother stood with tears streaming down her face, where Mr. Chun watched with pride shining in his old eyes, where the other staff members had gathered in the shadows, the invisible people who kept this world running. Half of this money, Elena said, turning back to Richard, will go to a foundation. A foundation for children like me. Kids who have talent but no opportunity. Kids who are told they're not good enough because of where they come from, or how much money their parents make, or what school they go to. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I want to build music programs in schools that can't afford them. I want to give scholarships to students who could never dream of paying for lessons. I want to make sure that no kid with a gift ever has to practice on a paper keyboard because that's all they can afford. The crowd was silent. Richard stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Done, he said. Elena finally reached out and took the check from his hand. The paper felt light and thin, almost fragile. It was hard to believe that this tiny rectangle could change so many lives. Richard cleared his throat. I have one more thing to say. Elena looked at him warily. The foundation you're starting, he said. I want to be its first donor. Another $50 million. On top of what I already owe you. This time, the gasps came from Elena. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard smiled, and for the first time, it almost looked genuine. Consider it an apology. For every person in this house I never bothered to see. The applause that followed was different from before. It was warmer somehow, softer. People weren't just clapping for Elena's music anymore. They were clapping for something bigger, something that felt like change. Rosa pushed through the crowd and ran to her daughter. She wrapped her arms around Elena so tightly that neither of them could breathe. They stood there crying and laughing and holding each other while the cameras flashed and the guests watched. I'm so proud of you, Mia, Rosa whispered. So proud. Your father would be so proud. Elena held her mother even tighter. Her father had passed away when she was just 3 years old. She barely remembered him, but she knew that he had loved music too. She liked to think he was watching tonight, somewhere later that evening. After most of the guests had gone home, Elena found Mr. Chun standing alone in the empty ballroom. He was looking at the piano with a faraway expression, lost in memories. Thank you, Elena said softly. I couldn't have done this without you. Mr. Chun turned to her and smiled. You had the gift all along. I just helped you believe in it. Will you play again? Now that you know you still can? The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. His wrinkled hands hovered over the keys. Maybe, he said. Maybe it's not too late for me either. He began to play. A soft, beautiful melody that filled the empty room with warmth. Elena stood and listened, tears rolling down her cheeks. Tonight, she had won more than money. She had won something that couldn't be measured or counted. She had won the right to be seen. 3 years later, Elena graduated from Juilliard at the top of her class. She performed at Carnegie Hall to a sold-out crowd. Critics called her one of the most talented pianists of her generation, but she never forgot where she came from. The Elena Reyes Foundation grew beyond anything she had imagined. It provided music education to over 50,000 underprivileged children in its first 5 years. Schools across the country started programs with its funding. Hundreds of scholarships were given to students who reminded Elena of herself. Rosa retired from housekeeping and moved into a beautiful home that Elena bought for her. It had a garden filled with flowers and a piano in every room. Mr. Chen became the foundation's first music teacher. He spent his final years doing what he had always loved, helping young people discover the magic of music. And Richard Harrington? He never missed a single one of Elena's concerts. He sat in the front row every time, listening with eyes that had finally learned to see. Some people said he changed after that night. That something inside him broke open and let the light in. Elena liked to believe that was true, because if a maid's daughter could become a world-famous pianist, and an old butler could play again after 30 years, Then, maybe even a cold-hearted billionaire could learn what really matters. Some lessons come from books. Some come from teachers. And some come from a 19-year-old girl with blistered fingers and a borrowed dress, playing her heart out on a $2 million piano. That night, 300 people learned something they would never forget. True wealth has nothing to do with money, and the most powerful music often comes from the most unexpected places.